They called him the Sovereign of Silence. Williams Dean didn't have a conscience. He had a calculator where his soul should be, weighing every life against its usefulness. His estate was a cathedral of fear, and his word was scripture carved in bone. Rule number 1, no unauthorized souls cross the threshold. Ever. But on a rain-slicked midnight in June, Simbi, his trembling housemaid, had run out of options. The care facility called at 11:47 p.m. Flooding, evacuation, nowhere else to go. She brought the only family she had left, her grandmother Rebecca, through the service entrance into forbidden territory. The grandfather clock struck midnight. Thunder cracked like a judge's gavel. Simbi's breath turned to ice in her lungs as she heard the unmistakable sound. Italian leather on polished obsidian floors. Steady, measured, final. Williams Dean emerged from the shadows, his white shirt collar still stained crimson from whatever business he'd just concluded in the East Wing. His security team flanked him like angels of death, red laser sights already painting surgical precision on the elderly woman in the faded floral dress who stood humming an old gospel tune, completely unaware she'd just signed her own death warrant. Simbi's vision blurred with tears. She pulled her grandmother close, her lips moving in silent prayer, waiting for the crack of gunfire that would paint the walls with their final story. But the sound never came. Instead, she heard something that shattered every law of nature she thought she understood. The rustle of expensive fabric crumpling to the floor, followed by a voice she'd only heard issue commands and pronounce sentences, now broken, trembling, barely a whisper. Mother, you're alive. How it started. The call came at 11:47 p.m., shattering the careful silence Simbi had wrapped around herself like armor. Her grandmother's care facility was flooding. The storm had overwhelmed the drainage system, and they were evacuating everyone within the hour, no exceptions. Simbi stood in the servants' corridor, her phone trembling against her ear, calculating impossible math. Her aunt was in Chicago. Her cousin had 3 kids in a 1-bedroom apartment. Every other option dissolved like sugar in rain, leaving only one terrible answer: the Dean estate, where unauthorized guests didn't leave in ambulances, they left in bags. She had exactly 43 minutes before the facility would release Rebecca onto the street. The service entrance was a calculated risk. At this hour, Williams would be in the East Wing conducting what the staff euphemistically called private meetings. The security rotation changed at midnight. If she timed it perfectly, if she moved like smoke, if God decided to show up for work tonight, she might survive this. Simbi's hands shook as she disabled the motion sensor, a trick she'd learned from watching the maintenance crew. The storm provided cover, rain hammering against the windows loud enough to mask the soft click of the lock disengaging. She slipped out into the night, her maid's uniform soaked through before she reached her decade-old Honda. Rebecca was waiting on a bench outside Riverside, a small overnight bag at her feet, humming something that sounded like church. She smiled when she saw Simbi, that distant smile that meant she was somewhere between yesterday and 20 years ago. "Baby girl," Rebecca said, her voice soft with confusion. "Is it Sunday already?" "Yes, Grandma," Simbi lied, helping her into the car. "We're going somewhere safe." The drive back felt like swimming through concrete. Every red light was a judgment. Every passing car might be Williams returning early. Simbi's mind raced through contingency plans that all ended the same way, with her grandmother discovering exactly what kind of monster Simbi worked for. She parked 3 blocks away and walked Rebecca through the garden entrance, using the overgrown hedges as cover. The servants' quarters were barely more than converted storage rooms, but they had locks, privacy, the illusion of safety. Inside, Simbi helped Rebecca onto the narrow bed, tucking the threadbare quilt around her shoulders. The old woman's eyes were already closing, exhaustion finally catching up to the adrenaline. "This is a nice hotel," Rebecca murmured, her fingers clutching Simbi's hand. "You always take such good care of me." Simbi's throat burned. "Rest now, Grandma. I'll be right outside." She locked the door from the outside and leaned against it, her heart hammering against her ribs like a prisoner testing bars. She'd done it. Rebecca was safe, hidden, invisible. For now. The grandfather clock downstairs began to chime each midnight, a countdown to discovery. Simbi woke to absence. The narrow bed in the servants' quarters was empty, the quilt folded with the precise corners Rebecca had learned in her nursing days, back when her mind still held on to things like muscle memory and routine. The door stood open, just a crack, but enough to let the cold certainty flood in. Her grandmother had wandered. Simbi's feet hit the floor before conscious thought caught up. She grabbed her robe and ran, her mind cataloging every terrible possibility. The kitchen, maybe. The garden. Please, God, let it be the garden. But the universe had stopped taking her calls. She rounded the corner from the servants' corridor, and her entire world collapsed into a single crystallized moment of horror. The main hall stretched before her like a cathedral built to worship power, all black marble and soaring ceilings, with portraits of dead men in expensive frames watching from the walls. And there, standing in the exact center of that forbidden space, was Rebecca. She wore her faded floral dress and quilted house slippers. Her silver hair caught the light from the chandelier overhead, making her look almost ethereal. She was humming that old gospel tune again, something about crossing over Jordan, completely unaware that she'd just crossed a line people died for approaching. "Grandma," Simbi whispered, but the word dissolved in her throat, because Williams Dean had just entered from the opposite corridor. He moved like a judge walking toward the gallows, flanked by two of his security team. His white shirt was still stained from whatever he'd been doing in the East Wing, rust-colored evidence that he'd spent the evening reminding someone why obedience mattered. His face was carved from the same cold stone as the mansion itself, all sharp angles and calculated violence. The security team's hands moved to their holsters in perfect synchronization. Red laser sights bloomed like flowers across Rebecca's chest, 3 perfect points of execution. Rebecca turned toward the sound of approaching footsteps. Her face brightened with the kind of genuine warmth that belonged to a different world entirely, a world where strangers were just friends you hadn't met yet. "Oh, hello there," she said, her voice carrying that slight tremor of age and absolute fearlessness. "What a beautiful home you have. Reminds me of the old Morrison place back in Los Angeles before they tore it down. You must be the man of the house. I'm Rebecca. I'm terribly sorry for the intrusion. My grandbaby brought me here, and I'm afraid I got a bit turned around. These old legs don't listen like they used to." She smiled at him like he was a neighbor borrowing sugar. Williams Dean stopped walking. The entire mansion seemed to stop breathing. Simbi watched his expression shift through something she couldn't name, recognition, perhaps, or the resurrection of a ghost he'd buried decades ago. His hand, which had been rising toward his security team in what could only be a kill order, froze mid-gesture. Then, impossibly, it began to tremble. The silence stretched like a wire pulled too tight, ready to snap and slice through everything in its path. Williams Dean stood frozen in a posture Simbi had never seen him adopt. Uncertainty made flesh. The man who had once executed a lieutenant for hesitating during a simple yes or no question was now suspended in indecision, his face cycling through expressions that had no business existing on features that cold. His security chief, Marcus, shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. The laser sights remained steady on Rebecca's chest. They were waiting for the signal. For the slight nod or hand gesture that would end this violation of protocol with surgical efficiency. But Williams Dean wasn't looking at his men. He was staring at Rebecca like she was a photograph come to life, like she was proof that the past could walk through walls and find you no matter how many layers of violence you'd wrapped around yourself. "Morrison Place," he whispered, and the words sounded like they'd been dragged up from somewhere deep and buried. "Los Angeles, 1995. Rebecca tilted her head, her eyes narrowing with the effort of trying to place a face her memory no longer filed correctly. "Have we met before, dear? Forgive me, my mind isn't what it used to be. These days I forget if I've had breakfast, but somehow I can still remember every word of every hymn I learned as a girl." She laughed softly, the sound completely incongruous with the 3 loaded weapons pointed at her. Williams's jaw clenched. His hands, which had orchestrated countless acts of calculated cruelty, were shaking now. Simbi watched in paralyzed disbelief as something cracked behind his eyes. Not breaking, but opening, like a door that had been welded shut was being pried apart by crowbar force. Then he moved. Marcus tensed, expecting the execution command. The other guards straightened, ready to dispose of the body and scrub the marble clean before sunrise. Instead, Williams Dean dropped to his knees. The sound of expensive Italian leather hitting polished obsidian echoed through the hall like a gunshot. His $6,000 suit crumpled as he bent forward, his spine curving into a perfect 90-degree angle, his forehead nearly touching the floor. It was a bow of absolute reverence, the kind of bow reserved for royalty or gods, the kind of bow Williams Dean had never performed for anyone in his entire criminal empire. Marcus's gun hand wavered. The other guards exchanged glances that bordered on panic. In their world, this was more than unexpected. It was apocalyptic. The sovereign didn't kneel. He didn't bow. He certainly didn't prostrate himself before confused elderly women in floral dresses and house slippers. "Mother," he said, and his voice cracked on the word like he was 13 years old again, like he was hungry and alone and desperate for someone to tell him he mattered. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry you had to find me like this." Rebecca's confusion deepened, but her hand, operating on instinct older than memory, reached down to touch the top of his head. "Oh, sweetheart," she said gently, "there's nothing to apologize for." Simbi's knees gave out. She grabbed the doorframe to keep from collapsing, watching her carefully constructed world dissolve into something she couldn't begin to comprehend. Los Angeles, 1995. Summer heat that turned asphalt to tar and made breathing feel like drowning in warm soup. The boy who would become Williams Dean was 14 years old and had been living on the streets for 6 months. He'd run from the foster home after the 3rd time Mr. Henderson came into his room at night. Better to starve with dignity than survive on your knees. He'd learned the rhythms of survival, which dumpsters the restaurants used, which alleys the police avoided, how to make himself invisible when the predators came hunting. But 3 days without food had made him sloppy, desperate. He tried to steal an apple from the corner market, and the owner had chased him 4 blocks before he collapsed behind a liquor store, his vision swimming with black spots. He woke to the smell of something impossible, real food. The apartment above the liquor store was barely bigger than a closet, with peeling linoleum and a window unit that coughed out lukewarm air. But the woman standing over him had kind eyes and hands that moved with practiced gentleness as she pressed a cool cloth to his forehead. "Easy now," Rebecca said, her voice carrying the musical lilt of the South. "You've got heat stroke, baby. When's the last time you ate?" He tried to lie, but his stomach betrayed him with a growl that sounded like violence. She fed him chicken soup from a pot that seemed bottomless, with saltine crackers and sweet tea so cold it made his teeth ache. She didn't ask questions he couldn't answer, didn't demand to know where his parents were or why a 14-year-old was sleeping behind dumpsters. She just fed him, then made up the couch with clean sheets that smelled of lavender. "You can stay until you're strong enough to move on, but while you're under my roof, you follow my rules. You say grace before meals, you keep yourself clean, and you remember that whatever life did to put you out there on those streets, it doesn't get to define who you become." He stayed for 3 months. She worked double shifts at the nursing home, but every night she came home and cooked. She taught him to read beyond a 3rd grade level, using her Bible and old newspapers. She made him memorize verses about dignity and redemption, about being more than your circumstances. "What's your real name, baby?" she asked one night while they washed dishes together. "Billy," he whispered. "Billy Dean." "Well, Billy Dean, you've got something special in you. I can see it. You're going to do important things." She dried her hands and pulled him into a hug that felt like the first safe thing he'd experienced in years. "Just promise me you'll remember where you came from. Promise me you'll stay human." He left on a Tuesday morning while she was at work, leaving a note that just said, "Thank you, Mother." He couldn't risk her getting pulled into the life he was building, the one that would eventually swallow the boy named Billy whole and spit out the monster called Williams. But he never forgot the woman who called him son when no one else would. Williams rose from his bow with the careful deliberation of a man trying to reassemble himself from shattered pieces. His eyes were red-rimmed but dry. He'd forgotten how to cry somewhere between Los Angeles and the empire he'd built on other people's fear. Marcus still had his weapon drawn, though the laser sight had drifted away from Rebecca's chest. The security chief's face was a mask of professional confusion, trying to calculate the correct response to a situation that had no precedent in any protocol manual. "Sir," Marcus said carefully, his voice pitched low enough that only Williams could hear, "we need to secure the perimeter, establish identity, run background checks. This could be a—" Williams turned to face him, and whatever Marcus saw in his expression made the rest of that sentence die in his throat. "You aimed a weapon," Williams said, each word carved from permafrost, "at my mother." "Sir, I was following standard—" "You painted her with a laser sight." Williams took a step closer, and Marcus, a former Marine who'd survived Fallujah and 3 separate cartel assassination attempts, actually retreated. "You put your finger on a trigger and contemplated ending the life of the woman who saved mine when I was nothing but a starving kid with no future." Marcus's jaw tightened. "I was doing my job." "Your job," Williams said softly, and that softness was more terrifying than any shout, "just ended. You have 60 seconds to leave my property. If you're still here at 61, they'll find pieces of you scattered across 3 states. Marcus looked like he wanted to argue, to appeal to logic or protocol or the 15 years of loyal service he'd given, but he was smart enough to recognize a door that had closed permanently. He holstered his weapon, nodded once, and walked toward the exit with whatever dignity he could salvage. Williams turned to the remaining guards, who suddenly found the marble floor fascinating. "New rule, effective immediately. This woman is untouchable. She is sacred. If she wanders into the armory at 3 in the morning and starts reorganizing the ammunition, you smile and offer to help. If she wants to redecorate the torture room with flower arrangements, you bring her daisies. Am I making myself clear?" "Yes, sir," they responded in unison, the words coming out like a prayer. Williams's expression softened as he returned his attention to Rebecca, who had been watching this exchange with the bemused patience of someone who'd seen too much life to be surprised by anything. He offered her his arm with the courtly grace of a man from a different era. "Mother, I'm giving you the master suite. It has better light, a proper bathroom, and a view of the garden you'll appreciate." "Oh, that's far too much trouble," Rebecca began. "It's not trouble," Williams said, and for the first time in decades he smiled like he meant it. "It's the least I can do for my Halmoni." Simbi, still frozen in the doorway, watched her carefully ordered world complete its transformation into something unrecognizable. The monster had just become human, and somehow that was more terrifying than anything she'd witnessed before. Rebecca discovered the kitchen at dawn, drawn by some internal compass that dementia hadn't managed to scramble. She stood in the doorway of the industrial-grade culinary cathedral, all stainless steel and marble countertops, and shook her head with the disappointed expression of a woman who'd seen kitchens that actually felt like home. "Nobody's cooked a real meal in here for years," she announced to no one in particular. "I can tell. A kitchen has a spirit, and this one's been sleeping." The estate's chef, a Michelin-trained professional named Laurent, who'd prepared meals for heads of state, watched in stunned silence as this elderly woman in a floral dress began opening his cabinets with the casual authority of someone inspecting a crime scene. "Madame, I assure you, everything is organized according to—" "Where's your cast iron?" Rebecca interrupted, pulling out a copper-bottomed pan and examining it with clear disapproval. "And these spices are all wrong. Herbs lose their soul when you keep 'em this long." She turned to face Laurent with eyes that had gone sharp despite the fog that usually clouded them. "Baby, I'm going to need you to take me to a real grocery store, not one of those fancy places where they charge $15 for an onion. A real one." Laurent looked desperately toward the doorway, where Williams had appeared with the silent efficiency of a ghost. The Mafia boss was wearing a different shirt, this one without bloodstains, and something in his posture had shifted overnight, like he was remembering how to stand in a way that didn't constantly telegraph threat. Give her whatever she needs. Carte blanche. By noon, Rebecca had transformed the kitchen into something that smelled like resurrection. Collard greens simmered in a pot big enough to bathe in, seasoned with ham hocks and secrets. Cornbread baked in that cast iron she'd made Laurent hunt down from a restaurant supply store. Black-eyed peas bubbled alongside rice that had been cooked with actual love instead of precise measurements. At exactly 1 o'clock, Rebecca appeared in Williams's office doorway, wooden spoon in hand like a scepter. "Billy Dean," she said, and the use of his childhood name made every man in the room freeze. "Lunch is ready, and I better not see you hunched over that desk like some kind of vulture. We eat at the table like civilized people." Williams looked up from a contract that was essentially someone's death warrant rendered in legalese. His lieutenants, men who'd watched him break bones with his bare hands, held their breath, waiting to see if the sovereign would remind this old woman who gave orders in this house. Instead, Williams set down his pen, straightened his spine, and followed her to the dining room like a schoolboy called home for supper. She made him sit, made him put his napkin in his lap, made him eat his vegetables before he could have seconds of the cornbread. "Your posture is terrible," she said, tapping his shoulder with that wooden spoon. "Sit up straight. I didn't raise you to slouch like some kind of criminal." The irony hung in the air like smoke, but nobody dared laugh. Williams sat up straight and ate his greens. The most dangerous man in the city had finally met his match, and she was armed nothing but a wooden spoon and the memory of who he used to be. The whispers started in the places where power was measured in blood and territory. Backroom poker games, late-night meetings in industrial warehouses, conversations held in cars with tinted windows circling the same block 3 times. The sovereign had gone soft. Marcus, still nursing his wounded pride along with severance pay that felt like hush money, had talked. Not much. He valued his life too much for that, but enough. An old woman was living in the master suite. Williams Dean, the man who'd once fed a rival to his own dogs for disrespecting his authority, was eating collard greens at a dining table and saying grace before meals. In the ecosystem of organized crime, weakness was blood in the water, and the sharks were already circling. Victor Kozlov heard the rumors in his Brighton Beach fortress and smiled the way wolves smile when they spot a limping deer. He had been waiting 15 years for an opening, watching Williams build an empire that should have been his. Now the old lion had adopted a grandmother and forgotten how to roar. "He's playing house," Victor told his counsel, lighting a Cuban cigar that cost more than most people's monthly rent. "While he's learning to say please and thank you, we take the South Harbor operations. We take them quietly, professionally, and by the time he notices, it'll be too late to respond without looking desperate." In Chinatown, Marguerite Chen received the intelligence with more caution. She'd survived 40 years in a business that killed most players within 5 by knowing when to strike and when to wait. Williams Dean didn't make mistakes, which meant this wasn't a mistake. "He fired Marcus," her lieutenant pointed out. His head of security, over some old woman nobody's ever heard of? Exactly, Marguerite said, watching the street below through bulletproof glass. Nobody's heard of her, which means she's important enough that Williams kept her secret for decades. That's not weakness, that's protection. But her lieutenant had the hungry look of someone who'd been second in command too long. The others are moving. If we don't, then we'll watch them die and learn from their mistakes. At the mansion, Simbi noticed the changes first. The usual delivery trucks were late. The vendors who normally couldn't wait to curry favor with the Dean estate were suddenly apologetic about supply chain issues. The phone calls that used to come at all hours had slowed to a trickle. She found Williams in his study, staring at reports that painted a clear picture. 4 of his minor operations had been hit in the last 48 hours. Small losses, barely worth his attention individually, but together they spelled out a message in neon letters. "They think you're vulnerable," Simbi said quietly. Williams didn't look up from the papers. His jaw was tight, but his hands were steady. "I know." "Are you?" she asked, then immediately regretted the question. He finally met her eyes, and what she saw there made her remember why people called him the Sovereign. The kindness he'd shown Rebecca hadn't erased the monster. It had just taught it something more dangerous than cruelty. "No," Williams said softly. "I'm just deciding how many examples I need to make before they remember why they were afraid in the first place." Viktor Kozlov made his move on a Thursday night because Thursdays were when Williams traditionally had dinner with Rebecca, a schedule that had become as predictable as a death sentence if you were stupid enough to see it that way. The South Harbor warehouse was supposed to be an easy take. Victor sent 20 men armed with military-grade weapons and the confidence that comes from believing your enemy has forgotten how to fight. They cut through the perimeter security like it was made of tissue paper, disabled the alarms, and walked into what should have been a storage facility full of merchandise worth 7 figures on the street. Instead, they walked into a killing floor. The lights came on all at once, blinding and surgical. Williams stood in the center of the warehouse, alone, wearing the same tailored suit he'd worn to dinner. He'd excused himself between the collard greens and the peach cobbler, kissed Rebecca on the forehead, and told her he had a brief errand to run. "Gentlemen," Williams said, his voice carrying in the sudden silence, "I appreciate you gathering in one place. Saves me the trouble of hunting you individually." Victor's men raised their weapons, 20 barrels trained on one target. The odds were mathematically impossible. No one walked away from 20 to 1, not even the Sovereign. Williams smiled, and it was the smile of a man who'd been holding something back and had finally been given permission to let it loose. What happened next would be discussed in whispers for years, the details growing more baroque with each retelling. But everyone agreed on the fundamentals. Williams Dean didn't just win, he made art out of violence, conducting brutality like a symphony where every broken bone was a perfectly timed note. He moved like water and struck like lightning. The first 3 men went down before they could pull their triggers. The next 5 learned that bullets were useless against someone who'd studied every angle, every shadow, every possible vector of attack with the obsessive focus of a man who'd built an empire on being unkillable. When it was over, and it was over quickly despite the numbers, Williams stood in the center of a room full of men who'd learned the difference between wounded and dead, between mercy and weakness. They were alive because he'd chosen to let them breathe, and that choice was more terrifying than any body count. He pulled out his phone, wiped someone else's blood from the screen, and made a call. "Victor," Williams said pleasantly, as if he were discussing the weather, "I have something that belongs to you. 20-somethings, actually. They're damaged, but they'll heal, eventually." He paused, listening to the silence on the other end. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to send flowers to my mother, Rebecca Davis, care of the Dean estate. Roses, not carnations. Quality matters.
And then you're going to remember why you spent 15 years waiting instead of moving." He hung up without waiting for a response. By the time Williams returned to the mansion, dessert was still warm. Rebecca looked up from her peach cobbler and smiled. "Everything all right, baby?" "Everything's perfect, Mother," Williams said, sitting down and picking up his fork. "Just reminding some folks about proper manners."
6 months after Rebecca moved into the master suite, Williams woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of humming drifting up from the kitchen. For a moment, that suspended space between sleep and consciousness, he was 14 again, waking on a threadbare couch in a tiny apartment above a liquor store, safe for the first time in his life. Then reality settled back into place, but somehow it didn't feel like a weight anymore. He found Rebecca at the stove, making eggs the way she'd always made them, scrambled soft with cheese and a pinch of paprika, served with buttered toast cut diagonally because presentation matters even at breakfast. She'd reorganized his entire kitchen in the past 12 weeks, fired his chef, and hired 3 grandmothers from her church who cooked like they were feeding angels. "Morning, Billy," she said without turning around. Most days she remembered who he was now, though occasionally she still called him by other names. Boys she'd fostered over the years, children who'd passed through her life like water through gentle hands. He answered to all of them. "Morning, Mother." He poured himself coffee from the pot she'd brewed strong enough to resurrect the dead. "You sleep all right?" "Like a baby in the arms of Jesus." She plated his eggs with the efficiency of someone who'd fed multitudes. "Now sit down and eat before it gets cold. And I want to talk to you about something." William sat, recognizing the tone that meant negotiation was not an option. "What's on your mind?" Rebecca settled into the chair across from him, her hands folded on the table in that way she had when she was about to deliver truth, whether you wanted to hear it or not. "I've been thinking about that young man you had working for you, Marcus." William's jaw tightened. "He pointed a weapon at you. He was doing his job, protecting you from what he thought was a threat." Rebecca's eyes, clear this morning, sharp with the wisdom that dementia couldn't quite erase, held his with uncomfortable precision. "You taught him to be that way, to see danger everywhere, to shoot first and ask questions never." "He's fine," William said flatly. "I gave him enough money to retire." "Money isn't the same as forgiveness, baby." She reached across the table and took his hand, her fingers papery and warm. "I know what you are, what you've done. I'm not so far gone that I can't read between the lines. This beautiful house, these people who jump when you speak, that doesn't come from running a legitimate business." William started to pull away, but her grip tightened with surprising strength. "I'm not asking you to confess. I'm not asking you to change what you can't change, but I am asking you to remember that the boy I fed all those years ago, that hungry, scared child who said grace with his whole heart, he's still in there somewhere, and he deserves better than a life where the only people who bow to him do it out of fear." The words hit like physical blows, cracking something Williams had thought was unbreakable. "I don't know how to be both," he admitted, and the confession felt like bleeding. "The man you remember and the man I became." "You don't have to choose," Rebecca said simply. "You just have to remember that true power isn't making people kneel. It's knowing when to kneel yourself." Williams looked around the kitchen, at the morning light streaming through windows he'd had bulletproofed, at the table where he now ate meals instead of conducting business, at the woman who'd saved his life twice, 30 decades apart. The mansion was still a fortress. His empire still ran on fear and calculated violence. He was still the sovereign, still untouchable, still dangerous enough that grown men checked their shadows for his approach. But now, every evening at 6 o'clock, he sat at a dinner table and let an elderly woman with dementia correct his posture. He said grace before meals. He listened to stories he'd heard 17 times before and laughed like it was the first telling. "I fired Marcus because he threatened you. But you're right. He deserves better than my anger." He pulled out his phone, typed a message he'd been too proud to send for 3 months. "I'm offering him his job back. Different role. Head of residential security. His only job will be keeping you safe." Rebecca's smile could have powered the entire city. "That's my Billy." She stood, patted his cheek with the casual affection of someone who'd earned the right, and started clearing the plates. William sat in the morning light, drinking coffee that tasted like redemption, and realized he'd finally found what he'd been searching for since he was 14 years old and starving on the streets of Los Angeles. Not power, not respect, not an empire built on fear. Home. The sovereign had learned to bow, and in that bowing had discovered he'd been kneeling to the wrong gods his entire life. True strength isn't in making others submit, it's in choosing someone worthy of your submission. He'd spent 30 years building walls. Rebecca had walked through them like they were made of smoke, armed nothing but collard greens and unconditional love. And for the first time since he left that tiny apartment above a liquor store, Williams Dean felt like he might actually deserve to be called someone's son.
Don't leave yet. If this story touched your heart, hit that subscribe button so you never miss another chapter. These stories of redemption, power, and unexpected love don't write themselves. Your support keeps them coming. Like this if Williams and Rebecca's journey moved you. Every thumbs up tells me you want more stories where the monsters learn to be human again. Share this with someone who needs to remember that it's never too late to find your way home. Someone out there needs to read about a grandmother who walked through bulletproof walls with nothing but love and a wooden spoon. Drop a comment below. What did you think of William's transformation? Should I write more stories like this? Your thoughts fuel the next chapter. The sovereign found his peace. Now help others find this story. Subscribe, like, share, because the best stories are the ones we share together.